Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel, and I'd like to welcome everyone back to this week's episode of Daki Time. Before we get the video started, like always, I'd like to welcome all the new people here to the channel. If you are new, consider subscribing to this channel. It's the most direct way you all can impact my life and support me through YouTube. I'd also like to mention the links to all my channels and things and merch stores are in the description down below, so go and check all of that out. Alright, with all that said, let's begin the video. Alright, so this week's video, we have a question from Avatar, and Avatar asked this very cool question. He basically asks the 10 reasons why you should not do King's Rest. Now, it comes at no surprise that King's Rest is one of those dungeons that people try to avoid, and I just realized I still have my headset on. So it is one of those dungeons that people do avoid, and for several reasons. We're going to do this in a slightly different manner. We are going to go into the dungeon, hence why I had my headset on. We're going to do a run, and we're going to go through a couple of reasons why. Now, Avatar, I don't think I can come up with 10 reasons, but I can and will come up with a few reasons why King's Rest is not taken, and a few of my reasons why. Now, overall, I would just like to say that King's Rest as a dungeon and a laid out dungeon is a very fun and cool dungeon if you can get a handle on a couple of the things I'm going to raise points on. So guys, join us as we jump in and have a look at the King's Rest dungeon. It really doesn't come as a shock to see that these sort of dungeons have hard trash, and I'm not talking super hard trash where you absolutely can't do the dungeon. That's not it. King's Rest is absolutely doable, and it's quite doable, I should mention. So why do people still try and avoid King's Rest, especially on, say, a Mythic 10 or roundabouts the Mythic 10s? And quite simply, there's really only two main reasons, and the rest of the reasons are just reoccurring. So we'll get onto that as we go through the dungeon, but right now, just enjoy a bit of gameplay. So, the dungeon itself is quite fun, laid out in a very much linear serpent sort of structure here. There's no way you can get lost in this dungeon. There's no way that you can accidentally get pulled off the path. So, the dungeon itself laid out is quite fine, but what is the biggest reason? One of the biggest reasons that people are upset about this dungeon, and one of those reasons is simply trash. Now, the trash itself has been reported to be overpowered, numerous, extremely numerous, and people are like, you know what, it is just difficult to burn down some of these ads. They have a point, it's definitely true, but I would also like to make and draw a conclusion here to, say, Quarter Stars in Legion. When Quarter Stars, or even Archway, when those two dungeons came out, granted, they were two specific dungeons, and they came out, you know, not straight off the bat, like King's Rest and, you know, some of the others have. But at the end of the day, they were two dungeons that were significantly harder than the normal, or the Stouting dungeons. So, if you were to say that King's Rest is overpowered, trash-wise, I'd also like to make and draw the conclusion to Court of Stars, which had a very similar effect. But a couple of the main reasons that people don't like doing King's Rest is simply the trash. How overpowered and strong the trash is compared to other dungeons. And they do have quite a decent point. The trash in King's Rest does require you to mechanics and focus a little bit more intense than, say, some of the other dungeons like Waycrest does. So making this dungeon on a, say, a teaming tyrannical, or even a teaming fortified, my apologies, is one of the reasons why people avoid this dungeon. So another reason why people don't like King's Rest, and it really follows up on the ads basically, is these mini bosses struck all around the dungeon. So this here, this room, even though it's just ads, in a sense it is classified as like a mini boss room, because it does have these mini bosses as such that you've got to burn down, and it's time consuming. There's no way around this. This dungeon forces you to go through these mini bosses in a way that, eats up time. Especially if you are doing, say, a 10 or a 9. You've got to have really high DPS, an exceptional healer, to do this on, say, Fortified. Now, does that make it impossible or anything more deadly than, say, other dungeons? In a way, it is probably a little harder than other dungeons. You are definitely correct. Impossible? No. Simply put, you've just got to be thinking about where you're standing, what each boss, or mini-boss in this case, does, where to stand, what to interrupt, and I mean, it can be a little bit overwhelming, but not impossible. But another reason why people do avoid this dungeon is the sheer mini-bosses that are in this dungeon. So again, to reiterate the point of the most common reason why people hate this dungeon is trash, and there's trash just simply everywhere. But again, the trash is not difficult as such. They have a few mechanics that you need to focus on. But overall, there's a lot of trash, and a lot of trash do a lot of damage. As you see here in front of this second boss, it's just a lot of trash. Granted, they're all the one type of mob, but there's a lot of trash. Now, another reason that I have been reading a lot on the forums is people are saying dungeon boss mechanics. Now, dungeon boss mechanics normally, or typically, only involve anything around about 2 to 3 mechanics per boss. Generally speaking, there's not much more than that there. So in all honesty, dungeon boss mechanics, not hard. Definitely not hard, but they do contain 2 to 3 boss mechanics per boss, and in some cases, remembering these boss mechanics while under the pressure of a key, as well as trying to do those mechanics and surviving, sometimes gets to some players, and that is another reason why people do stress out about doing this dungeon in particular. But overall, does it make the dungeon much harder than the others? No. A little bit more difficult, but not substantial. I guess one way to think about it is that the boss mechanics in this dungeon versus, say, a few of the other dungeons like Waycrest are a lot less forgiving than, the Waycrest bosses and such. So you could really think about it in a way that this dungeon itself, if you mess up one of the mechanics, and you don't do the right thing, such as the entomb on this boss as an example, it can get out of hand quite quickly. And I guess that's where people are coming from when they say that this dungeon, the boss mechanics in this dungeon in particular, are one of the more tricky to deal with. Now what we're doing is we're heading up to the Halls of Ash. Now this is the area where most people have most of the problems. This hallway here, which is the last hallway to the third boss, the longest hallway in the whole dungeon, is the hardest to get through. Now, it has a lot of ads, and this is the particular spot where people are finding the most trouble. There's a lot of ads here that you can CC, that you can stealth past, that you can circumvent, and they do have a lot of mechanics to deal with each. Now, the ads themselves are reoccurring throughout the bridge, so as you can see down the bridge there's more berserkers, witch doctors, right down the end there's more witch doctors again. So all in all, the ads are reoccurring, which means the mechanics are reoccurring. It's just that there's so many, and you need to space your pulls out so that you don't get overwhelmed with these ads. Now, there's healers amongst all of this as well. You got to make sure that you're interrupting heals. You got to make sure you're interrupting hexes. You got to make sure you're dealing with the hunters with their shots. So there's a lot of mechanics that people really have to deal with, and if you don't pull adequately, you can get overwhelmed very quickly. So the thing is that this brute here that I'm going to mark with a square, this brute here basically is the crux of why people are upset. Initially, this brute had a massive knockback, and the area was huge, but they seemingly scaled it down recently in a patch so that it was a bit more manageable, so that you could absolutely deal with the mechanic. But if you've got enough stuns in your group, if you've got enough awareness, you can generally get by here quite okay without much drama at all. Now the brute's coming back, we're going to pull him. And if you space your pulls out, guys, in King's Rest, it's not going to be such a bad issue. But this hallway in particular showed up on so many forums why people are upset about this dungeon in particular. Just the sheer amount of mobs that you've got to burn through. Now, granted, if you brought a couple of rogues, you can skip quite a few of this. Not all of it, but you can skip quite a bit of it. And that makes your life a lot easier. But this hallway, when I was reading the forums about this dungeon, was one of the ones on that list of why people don't do this dungeon. Okay, so we're heading down to the third boss. Now, when reading through a lot of people's comments about this dungeon, this boss here, or this council fight, I should say, came up quite a bit with mechanics and asking Blizzard to tone it down a little. Now, every boss does a couple of mechanics, and there's only 3 bosses in the council fight. The mechanics are quite simple, but if you're not paying attention, you can get out of hand, and you can generally muck it up really quickly. But this was one of the reasons why people were not doing this dungeon, or maybe possibly are still not doing this dungeon. The boss itself had, what, 6 mechanics in total, which put it at one of those bosses that you've really got to pay attention and focus on what you're doing. And again, the reason why people refuse to do this dungeon as much. So, going back to one of my second points here about mini-bosses, Shadow of Zul is a mini-boss, and Shadow of Zul does sort of a replica of the Zul fight, and sorry, I'm waiting for this hunter to catch up. So basically, Zul here replicates a couple of his abilities. Now, when this first came out, a lot of the time, people were dying to the mechanics, not knowing the mechanics, or simply the mechanics just hit like a truck. Absolutely did. But, especially on a high key, I should mention. But now that people have gotten aware of what the mechanics are and what to expect, it becomes so much easier. So much easier. Now, surprisingly enough, we're at the last boss here in King's Rest, and I've given you a few reasons why this dungeon is not taken as much as other dungeons, which are very just repetitive reasons, really. This boss here, King Dazar, he is a really fun fight, even on any key level. He does hit quite a bit. He hits quite a bit hard, you know, compared to some other bosses. However, the fight itself is fun, and it has enough mechanics to keep you sort of awake and alert into what's happening without making it ridiculous as far as difficulty goes. Again, if this was a fortified setting, this does actually become a little difficult with the sheer amount of damage taken, but mechanics wise, it's actually really fun. Guys, that was the King's Rest dungeon, and there are a couple of reasons why people do avoid the King's Rest dungeon itself. So basically, the reoccurring reasons are ads. Just more ads, all the ads. Ads are hard to burn down. So ads are just simply the crux of this dungeon, and there are a lot of ads that require a lot of focus, either through mechanics or through avoiding them, CCing them, moving around them, stealthing through them. So if you can get that down pat, if you know what ad does what, then you can really interrupt and CC and stun these ads to get around those ads in particular. So ads are the #1 reason, and through reading all the forums and listening to you guys on YouTube videos and listening to you guys through my Discord, you guys just hate all the ads, and it's no surprise. There are a lot of ads in King's Rest. A couple of the other reasons is boss mechanics. Now, there is a couple of boss mechanics that are very unforgiving. If you miss the interrupt on the poison dart, I believe it is, or poison shot, on the third boss, you're pretty much gonna die. If you don't get the entomb out quick enough, or if you don't get the correct entomb out, then basically it can get out of hand quite quickly. So there are a couple of mechanics that really throw the skew in the favor of being unforgiving. But overall, guys, if I was to draw the conclusion up here, is King's Rest a bad dungeon? And I'd like to say, no, it really is not. If you draw your conclusion back to Court of Stars or Archway, granted, they came in a little bit later. They were not dropped on us right at the beginning of the expansion. But have a look at the difficulty of Court of Stars and what you needed to bring to Court of Stars in order to get a key done quite quickly versus King's Rest. And I would like to bring the conclusion here that King's Rest feels less intense than Court of Stars did at the beginning of each one of these dungeons. And what I mean by that is the very first time you did a key in King's Rest versus the very first time you did Court of Stars in a key in Court of Stars, you will see that the King's Rest actually looks and favors easier than the Court of Stars did back in Legion. So guys, overall, are there harder dungeons going to come? And I would almost say yes. I mean, we've still got, 2 patches to come before the end of this expansion. I would almost bet that there are harder dungeons to come than King's Rest. Well, guys, that is the video. Avatar, thank you so much for asking this question. Guys, if you want a question answered on Daki Time, please leave it in the request tab of my Discord, and I will get to that as soon as I can. Until next time, everyone have a fantastic day, and I will see you all next time.